Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. Battle Cry of Pragmatism. Anschluss with America. Immigration to America is far too multifarious phenomenon to define any neat and simple categories, and there are nearly innumerable varieties of exceptions to parasitism. Furthermore, because there is no unanimity of opinion in America as to what constitutes the perfect immigrant, there can be no unanimity as to what does, or does not, constitute parasitism. For the sake of clarity, then, a specific illustration of American biological parasitism upon other nations will be presented. German Americans. Just as the fog of Christianity and political tradition began to clear among 19th-century German masses, large numbers headed for America. Friedrich Ludwig Jenn, the 19th century father of gymnastics and German nationalist, campaigned against the uncontrolled hemorrhaging of immigrants then flooding into America, believing it would sap the blood of the Volk. 1270. His foresight proved more insightful than that of many of his liberal opponents. While the Germans busied themselves with Alsace and Lorraine, America quietly achieved Anschluss with an even more numerous portion of the German nation. Anschluss with America meant not only the physical incorporation of the German population, but cultural assimilation to the American way of life. As Harvard political scientist Samuel P. Huntington clarified in Who Are We? America's national identity and values are not fundamentally based on universal secular ideas, but rather on a distinctive Anglo-Protestant culture that generations of immigrants have adopted and assimilated. To be American means to assimilate at least some aspects of the Anglo-Saxon way of life. Huntington pointed out that some isolated German immigrants in the 19th century resisted assimilation for generations, acting more like settlers than immigrants. 1271. These 19th century transplants called themselves Germans in America rather than German Americans. 1272. Part of the German population boom had begun early in America's history, prompting Benjamin Franklin to ask, why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens, who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them? It is likely that Franklin would have been overjoyed to learn history's verdict. Anglo-Saxon culture ultimately dominated German's culture, not only in America, but in many ways, across the world. In the Cousins' Wars, Religion, Politics, and the Triumph of Anglo-America, Kevin Phillips provides a sprawling internal account of the worldwide political victory of English-speaking civilization. Phillips accounted for the decisive significance of what he calls demographic imperialism and what I would call parasite imperialism. In 1914, 1 out of every 5 Americans was of German ancestry. Still, in 1997, 58 million Americans out of a total of 250 million listed German as their primary ancestry. 1273. Concentrated in the upper Midwest, the heartland of America, there are actually more Americans of German descent than Americans of Anglo-Saxon descent. Originating in what became the most populous European country outside of Russia, Germans constitute the largest white ethnic group in America. Despite numerical supremacy in the democratic USA, not only did 19th-century aspirations of many German Americans for a union of Germans in North America and as a result, the foundation of a new German fatherland 1274 come to naught. Intolerance for what is now called multiculturalism meant that Germans would be dominated by Anglo-Saxon conquest. In the First World War, it was a German American, John J. Pershing, who led America's armies against his ancestral homeland. In the Second World War, the same pattern repeated itself as, once again, the American meritocratic system produced a German American, Dwight D. Eisenhower, to lead his New World fatherland against his Old World fatherland. But this is not the only ethnic pattern of note over the course of those wars. During World War I, pro-war groups such as the American Defense Society and the National Security League flourished especially in the East among Americans of Anglo-Saxon descent, and they won increasing support from clergy of the denominations with strong and clear British root: Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Methodists and, most outspokenly, Episcopalians. One Congregationalist minister at Plymouth Church in New York called for exterminating the German people and the sterilization of 10 million German soldiers and the segregation of the women. The same war-hawking pattern would repeat itself among Americans of English descent, especially in the Northeast and Southeast, for pre-Pearl Harbor American intervention in the next World War. 1275. This ethnic pattern was paralleled by yet another influential one: Jewish support for intervention against Germany in both world wars. This is one of the most historically decisive expressions of what I have called the Anglo-Jewish convergence. By appropriating the Jewish fate of exile in America, the German diaspora effectively joined an Anglo-Jewish cause. I will emphasize the Anglo-Saxon side of this convergence only because they provided a central, decisive bridge between Jews and Germans in America towards the anti-German cause. German immigration to the New World was not only a quiet war lost to America. Germanic immigration to America proved to be one of the greatest defeats in the history of the German-speaking peoples. The consequences of American parasitism upon the German nation provide a classic, textbook example of genetically maladaptive behavior, which also became universalized towards the Anglo-Saxons themselves. This first silent war lost to the American parasite may have been one of the deciding factors in the German defeat in two world wars. American immigration affects a policy of parasite imperialism. The best strategy in such a war is to downplay conflict and to promote peaceful freedom, for peace and freedom is often the prime advantage America possesses in this war. Strengthening authority, denying individual freedoms, and, above all, denying economic opportunity would likely threaten the health of the national parasitic enterprise. The more aggressive and eugenically informed arguments for American immigration policy in the early 20th century constituted a kind of war against the body of other nations for the human resources that constitute the very substance of those nations. Eugenic arguments about immigration in early 20th century America were really arguments about how to be the most superior parasite. If we focus on the ends and not the means, American parasitism is comparable to the Nazi kidnapping of select Polish children. While most immigration from German-speaking lands took place before 1871, before a political entity called Germany formally existed, Frank Salter's theory of genetic interests provides a sound framework from which to begin to calculate Germany's loss. Genetic interests increase with kinship and come into play whether one is conscious of those interests or not. Whereas the German casualties in the world wars resulted in a relatively straightforward subtraction from the German nation, the population lost to America was multiplied by America's gain. Defeat by parasitic depletion was multiplied by the fact that those lost to the Anglo-Saxon way of life also fought under the banner of Americanism against their native German fatherland. Thus, when calculating German losses in both world wars, one must account for the Germans lost to America who are, directly or indirectly, also responsible for German deaths in Europe. The loss must be measured not only quantitatively in Germans, or Germany's allies, killed, but qualitatively, from foot soldiers to industrialists, to the role of Pershing and Eisenhower in making the American military an effective and efficient killing machine. 19th century American parasitism upon Germany was the leeching of a people still debilitated by the trance of Christianity. By the time Germany was unshackled from this spellbinding, the punishment for negligence had ripened to maturity. The populations sucked into the body of the American Dracula were then exploited with abandon, as they were then used to hammer their native fatherland into a final submissive impotence. Not once, but twice. It's a good thing for America that it believes all nations are created equal, even parasite nations. American morality is a corollary of its parasitic mode of existence, and therefore it should not be surprising that even victims of this parasite morality will give a sound finger-shaking upbraiding. Germans got so used to taking their beatings from the United States that they began to sincerely agree with the righteousness of the American parasite morality. Or, perhaps German acceptance of liberal democracy simply demonstrates that what they truly believe is that might makes right. American novelist of German descent, Kurt Vonnegut, wrote in A Man Without a Country, 2005. Even today there is a sort of Andreas fault line between German Americans and Anglos, but fainter all the time. During the First World War, the fault opened as wide and deep as a mouth of hell, although no German American had performed an act of treason. 1276 German Americans were traumatized by the fact that their government demanded that they betray the American principles of individual freedom so that they could betray their ancestral fatherland. Kevin Phillips attributes considerable amount of German American support for republicanism following these Democrat-driven conflicts to war-driven resentment. 1277 Even if it was a compounded betrayal, many German Americans, of course, simply preferred the American philosophy of freedom to the one they left behind. However, it is exactly because the conflict between freedom and duty in this case that elicits a key clarification of the political principles of liberal democracy. Going one step further, the conflict between freedom and duty also clarifies the conflict between liberal democracy and political eugenics. Chapter break. Hypocrites and pragmatists. Imagine the following situation. A German male in the early 20th century escaped the constraints of old world duty for peace and personal freedom in America. When he was naturalized as a U.S. citizen, the First World War broke out and his new government required him to forego some basic freedoms so that he could fulfill his national duty of warring against his native fatherland. Just as in the American Civil War, this soldier may have fought his own relatives or even his own brothers. How can such a man justify his willingness to both risk his life and kill his enemies? American political theorist Francis Fukuyama, in The End of History and the Last Man, posed the basic philosophical question this way: if the fundamental natural right was self-preservation of the individual, on what grounds could it ever be rational for an individual to die for his country rather than trying to run away with his money and his family? 1278 If individual self-interest is the premise of the liberal conception of rationality, then the man who dies for his country is simply irrational. In the concept of the political, German political theorist Carl Schmitt explicated the same point. In case of need, the political entity must demand the sacrifice of life. Such a demand is in no way justifiable by the individualism of liberal thought. No consistent individualism can entrust to someone other than to the individual himself the right to dispose of the physical life of the individual. 1279 The true misfit of American civilization is not the political dissident, radical feminist, or any other minority way of life that the distinctive principles of liberal democracy has evolved through a clarification of its basic premise of individual right. The true misfit of American principle is the individual, especially of the militaristic variety, who voluntarily risks his life to defend this orgy of selfishness. They are like true believers in the sense that their love of country is truly irrational, and Americans' willingness to die is incongruous with the self-centered goals of liberal democracy. The liberal order, strictly, principally speaking, comprehends only individual self-interest, not collectivist self-sacrifice. The right to life is the basic right from which all other rights follow. Rational individual self-interest leads one to do what the rich elites of the American system have traditionally done: hire a poor man to risk his life for him. The poor, who by definition do not run this plutocracy, are left to die for the rich. Those who sacrifice their lives to uphold and defend liberal democracy do this despite liberal democracy, not because of it. The point of principle here is that these sane draft dodgers should be understood, not as aberrations, but as exemplars of what liberal democracy stands for in principle: rational self-preservation. This point can be clarified as such: what were the principles that so many German Americans died for in the two world wars? A German American who believed that he fought for collective freedom, as opposed to individual freedom, would be fighting, in principle, for something closer Nazi principles. If a German American believed that he fought for individual freedom, he, strictly speaking, is wrong, for his very sacrifice violated the principle of individual freedom. The idealist who dies for freedom is actually dying for duty. The ideal that he is actually dying for, then, is the principle of hypocrisy. He says one thing, individual freedom is the greatest good, and does exactly the opposite, subordinating and sacrificing his individual freedom to the dictates of a group formed by the government. This is hypocrisy. In principle, he may have believed that individual liberty was more important than duty to the government. In practice, duty to the government violated individual liberty. If a German-American draftee had still been steeped in German idealistic philosophy, the two world wars would have been an excellent time to learn the Anglo-Saxon philosophy of pragmatism. Dying for freedom may be hypocritical, but it has this virtue going for it. Dying for freedom works. Never mind that it defies both reason and liberty. Risking one's life to war against the enemies of peace works. For what? For the preservation of non-existent collective whole. The modern, liberal philosophy that posits that there is no collective whole, only individuals, survive because individuals conceive of themselves as something more than individuals, and sacrifice themselves for the survival of the liberal democratic order as a whole. The end or goal of individualism was thus achieved with the individual as a means. With this in mind, let us take the case of the American who does not have any idealistic attitude towards freedom. Instead, he is utterly realistic or materialistic and simply concludes that fascism is just generally worse than liberal democracy. In this case, since sacrifice and duty is not in itself the content of the political system he thinks is preferable, but is simply a means towards preserving liberal democracy, what he is dying for is still not realistic freedom. He is dying for pragmatism. Since the actual sacrifice and death of the soldier is not individual freedom in itself, only a means to individual freedom, his death in battle actually exemplifies true pragmatism. Compromising individual freedom works so well, in fact, that pragmatism really should have been emblazoned on the American war flag. If true to his principles, he should have barked the battle cry of pragmatism as he stormed out to the front. Now we can account for the principles of the war dead. The idealist dead sacrificed their lives for hypocrisy, and the realistic dead sacrificed their lives for pragmatism. Draft dodgers of the 1960s such as President-to-be Bill Clinton were far more keenly aware of the liberal principles of their country than common American loyalists who volunteered to sacrifice their lives in violation of the sacred American goal of self-preservation. The 1960s counterculture could rightly show how grateful they were for the sacrifices of the previous generation by exercising their freedom to mock and laugh at their sacrifices. The true lovers of individual freedom were those who dodged the draft, or, among the rich, those who paid another to risk their lives in their place. In short, Fukuyama and Schmidt are both correct. The rights of the individual come at the expense of the duties of the individual. Once the German-American found himself on the front fighting the Germans, one can legitimately ask, who was more irrational? Was the German-American who defended civilization more rational than the German who had no delusion that he was fighting for individual rights? Which is better described as mindless obedience? The American who cannot even appeal to the very principles of individual rights he supposedly fights for to defend his obedience to the government, or a German who thinks that subordination to the collective good of Germany is superior to superficial and bankrupt Western talk of rights. The American of German descent had to violate New World principles of individual freedom in order to fight to violate Old World principles of collective freedom. If he counted himself a German-American, placing individualism over ethnicity, his sacrifice was irrational. If he counted himself as American-German, placing ethnicity over individualism, his sacrifice was also irrational. Whether justified by individual freedom or race, his sacrifice was logically unjustifiable. There is not only a kind of justice, but outrageous gall exhibited in the willful insanity of risking one's life to ensure the existence of a system from whose point of view risking one's life is insane. Cognition of these contradictions brings one to the root of the problem, the roots of liberal democracy itself. self. Without self-sacrifice, there could not have been the revolution of individualism, but pure individualism could not have made the revolution. Only provincialism, pragmatism, or rather, assimilation to Anglo-Saxondom, could allow the violation of individual freedom necessary for the survival of the spirit of 76. And this brings us to the missing piece of the revolutionary puzzle, the Saxon-Norman conflict, the kinship ethnic conflict that is more than individual freedom and more than Enlightenment rationalizations. Now we can understand what is really going on here. The real missing principle of the American Revolution is the principle of kin selection. American revolutionary principles obscure the root of the conflict in Anglo-Saxon nationalism against Norman domination. This is what makes a comprehensible insanity out of what would otherwise be an incomprehensible insanity. Otherwise, sacrifice for the America's democratic revolution itself would be the ultimate refutation of its own liberal principles. In short, the foundation of American liberal order is hypocrisy. It is simply not possible to understand the United States purely on the basis of its presumed bloodless principles. It is precisely by following out these historical contradictions that one is ultimately led to the Norman conquest. When the principle of Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism is accounted for, then the socio-biological foundation of this hypocrisy is at least comprehensible. If Samuel Huntington is right, then German Americans sacrificed themselves for an Americanism that is not universal, but the product of distinctively Anglo-Saxon form of Protestantism. When Norman-Saxon conflict is further accounted for, it becomes clear that German Americans sacrificed their lives and their original fatherland for principles that realized a form of Anglo-Saxon nationalism. The rest is history. One only has to look to the Irish mayors of Chicago to gauge the relatively unpolitical nature of the German contribution to America. As a group, Germans have characteristically contributed to the basic means of America, even against their own distinctive ends. German Americans were in an impossible position in those world wars. Their country asked them to serve in a time of need. The charge of dual loyalty appealed to their deepest weaknesses. Taken out of its original cultural context, the kin-selective strengths of unpolitical German loyalty were channeled into kin-selective weakness as Americans. It turns out that their feigned obedience to the call of their country can even turn them into traitors to their own blood. Chapter break. Sacrifices for the race. Back to text. Both eugenics and sacrifice in war violate the most basic rights of individuals. The right to life. The aims of eugenics, by its very nature, stands in direct conflict with the notion of the equal rights of equal individuals. To die for liberal democracy also violates the right to individual self-preservation. However, the converse can also hold. The eugenic principle of sacrificing life has been conceived of as an extension or corollary of the principle of sacrificing life in war. Sacrifice of life in the name of both war and eugenics can share the principle of service to a higher collective good. In The Right to Death, published in 1895, German theorist Adolf Jost argued that control of death belongs to the state, or Volk, not the individual. This stands in direct contrast with the individual's right to choose death, as in euthanasia. Yet this is only an extension of the state's rights in determining that its members should sacrifice their lives in war. Its justification is the same in war and peace. The overriding import of the existence and health of the collective body or socio-biological organism, the rights to death, are the key to the fitness of life. 1280. Yet the Americans who originated the eugenics movement, such as Charles Davenport, found themselves empowering the state to depower individual rights. If the state could take a person's life, Davenport judged, surely it could deny the lesser right of reproduction. 1281 inches. Other words, one practical violation of the principle of the right to life legitimated even more violations of the right to life. One might reasonably ask where these violations of rights could be expected to end. The violations of rights ultimately end in political philosophies like Nazism. Fritz Lenz, a German physician geneticist and leading ideologue of the Nazi racial hygiene program, believed that The state is not there to see that the individual gets his rights, but to serve the race. 1282 The existence of such a state is inconceivable without the superiority of duties to rights. An individualistic society lacks any compelling case for individuals to make social sacrifices in the name of a state whose legitimacy rests on the enforcement of human rights. Even liberals who support euthanasia over the right to life emphasize the voluntary nature of those individual cases. Only a societal consensus of a legitimate collective whole could collectively legitimate a breach of the individual right to live. Starting around the turn of the 20th century, sterilization eugenics were found all across the political spectrum, observed Daniel Cutlass. ALL took as higher the good of society over the rights of individuals. 1283 Here we find another example of Anglo-Saxon pragmatism at work. Just as the American who sacrifices his life for the principles of freedom is at most a hypocrite and at least a pragmatist, the same violation of principle is necessary to conceive of a higher good above the rights of human beings. Anglo-Saxon rights are rooted in the national experience of conquest. By the Normans, the conquest corrupted the belief in a higher collective whole that survived among the Germans. The pragmatic hypocrisies of Anglo-Saxon eugenicists and Morhawks are legacies of a broken Anglo-Saxon nation that never fully regenerated itself. Every inconsistency that followed is traceable to some original form of kin selection. Under these conditions, the Anglo-Saxon struggle against hereditary Norman control over politics helped catalyze the idea of rights. Yet rights in general counter Darwinian biological selection in general. In this way, Anglo-Saxon rebellion against hereditary subordination to Norman aristocracy universalized into rebellion against subordination to political control over biological evolution. Schellmayer, an early 20th century German eugenicist, illustrates how his nation differed. This natural law, the complete subordination of the individual interests under those of the species, must also be valid for human evolution.